Jesus said, like he's looking to change our lives, but our lives changed. And just because our lives are not changed doesn't mean that Jesus isn't doing anything. Maybe we're not.
And we are back with another episode of Second Take, where we're going to be sitting down, taking a second look at the message and content from one of our recent firstmin.church services. Here with lead pastor Ethan Luhman. We're going to be playing some clips for you guys and kind of just like talking through some ideas and some content from our new or upcoming sermon series. So we're talking about Renew.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any initial thoughts on Renew?
Well, it's pushing me. The thing I love about being a pastor is, I always try to push myself, and see how I need to learn, how I need to grow, how I need to, just reorient myself, to the scriptures, to God. And, this sermon series is pushing me in a lot of good ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think kind of going back through and kind of listening to some of the content, I think the biggest kind of like the structure that I try to start to form in my head or like initial questions are like, what is Renew? Why do we need it?
Mm-hmm.
And what exactly needs to be renewed? I think those are initially kind of like good things to tackle. I know we're going to be going, in future services, we're going to go a little bit more into some of kind of like the nuance of that, but kind of like just as a base to start at. Those are kind of some of the initial questions that's kind of my goal for us to kind of like chat about today and kind of go a little bit deeper.
Well, we come from the Lutheran Christian tradition, which isn't necessarily one that's big on revival, but in the American context, you got to look at this broad. They call them periods of revival, right? There's the Great Revival and all that kind of stuff, and you got like Billy Graham and all these crusades and all this kind of stuff, and revival becomes this big language, and I think the first step of revival or renewal or renovation, as Dallas Willard talks about it, the first step is really recognizing that something's wrong, and something's off. And I guess I feel like all of us have that sense right now, like something's off in our world, in our lives. There's just something off, and the temptation is always to look at external circumstances to say, well, something's off if I can just have more money, if I can just have that special person, whatever it might be, if that can just fall into line, everything will work for me. But the reality is we just worked through our evil series. The problem is also like it's within us. We're the problem. So we need to have that personal experience of renewal or revival that's going to actually transform our hearts and our souls, minds, body. So that's where we're going with Renew, right? So how can we work to that renewal? And it's also not our work. That renewal is the further reliance on what God is looking to bring from outside into our lives.
Do you think that those words are synonymous, revival and renewal, to some degree, or do you think there's some differences there?
Well, revive would be to revivify, which is to give life back, and renew is to make new again. So, new life. I don't know. They're pretty darn close. I would say. I would put them in the same category.
Sure. Yeah. Why do you think you're saying that it's maybe that's not necessarily as much of a part of the doctrine of
the Lutheran tradition? We come out of the German world, which isn't big on feelings.
That makes sense.
And I don't want to. Don't want to focus on some of those more touchy-feely maybe topics, but when we don't do that, I think we end up damaging ourselves because all of us have feelings. And like I was telling you before we got rolling, sometimes the people who appear to not have as many feelings may be more controlled by feelings, And so as Christians, we're called to pay attention to what God is doing and where our hearts are, and I think it's just a good call for us. Like, well, God made us to be good, Genesis 1. Things aren't good, and so how are we remade in the image of God? Because we're God's image bearers. So
sure, yeah. So I think you were saying that the kind of like the first step to renew or to renewal is to recognize that something is wrong. So I think that's going to lead us pretty nicely into our first clip here. Why don't we play that and react?
How far I've come as a person trying to lead others in the way of Jesus and do my best to follow Jesus. And even as I think about how far I've come, I also think about how far I haven't come. How many struggles there still are, like how much I can still have, how many weaknesses I still have, and how many failures still crop up. You know, I've come to learn that it's part of our biological process as humans to focus more on our failures than our successes, because, well, our failures might lead us to dying or severe problems, like when we lived in the wilderness and whatnot. But even still, right? My life doesn't always look or feel that different after such a long walk with Christ, and that's the challenge that we go through as people. We don't always know what it looks like or what it feels like.
Yeah, so that I don't know, I thought that was super interesting. Have you, just to kick this off here, have you heard the story of the good wolf and the bad wolf?
The good
wolf and the bad wolf. I was actually listening to a Joe Rogan podcast the other day in which they brought it up, and I went and read it at that point. And then when I was going through prepping for this this podcast, I was like, I feel like this really applies. I have it pulled up here. I'm going to read it really quick. It's very short.
Okay.
And I think it's going to kind of like hopefully.
Is it like an Aesop fable or something?
Yeah, I think it's like a fable type deal. So I'm going to read it really quick here. So, all right, this is the story of the good wolf and the bad wolf. An old man told his grandson, "My son, there is an endless battle that goes on inside all of us. It is between two wolves. One wolf is bad. He is anger, envy, regret, greed, arrogance, resentment, lies, superiority, and ego. The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." The grandson thought about it and then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" The old man answered, "The one you feed." So kind of that idea of, it's not a perfect analogy or a metaphor to what we're talking about, because both of those things have a place, you know, but kind of like the duality, or thinking about how like there is a place for us to recognize and not forget how broken we are, maybe, or the sin that's inside of us. But on the other hand, we can't focus too much on that. Those thoughts of our weaknesses and failures, if that's all we focus on, can be kind of, crippling, because we need that renewal. Like we have a desire for that renewal.
Yeah, and I guess part of the motivation for me leading with this story, is like to think about the span of 10, 15 years, celebrate my 10-year wedding anniversary today, and it's like, man, I've come through so much, and maybe there are so many ways that I've grown, and it's, unless we reflect, we don't always see the growth in our own lives as well. So there is the act of reflection that helps us, but the reality is that, man, as Christians, I don't think we have that many examples of like people who just live holy lives. Like we see the moral failures of like these famous pastors, and we're surrounded by Christians who, like, the some content of their faith life is that they take an hour out of Sunday mornings, they might volunteer at church, and like that's the only significant difference between them and somebody who's not a Christian. So part of the challenge is we don't necessarily see a progression in the life of Christians. And that, I don't know, maybe it leads to some cognitive dissonance. Like Jesus said, like he's looking to change our lives, but our lives changed. And just because our lives are not changed doesn't mean that Jesus isn't doing anything. Maybe we're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so to recognize, like, where am I investing my effort? Am I relying on God and His grace, or am I just kind of like He's just like an add-on, to my life?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of talking about how our lives as Christians should probably look more different than the lives of those who aren't Christians. I think you talked in your message a little bit about how people have this idea or this perception that following Jesus just leads to more guilt and shame. Like people from the outside, or even sometimes from the inside, like you get caught up in this, in thinking that like that's like, what more is there to it? Right. Like following these rules or like fulfilling these roles, can sometimes be hard to see the good in that, and we just get caught up in like, this is making me feel bad about myself. I feel guilty for doing this, and it's kind of like
So now
that,
I need to walk away from the
kind of
church.
feeding that bad
Right.
wolf per se, and to
And I
kind of
think
switch that up a little bit.
that's where deconstruction comes in. Like I got to deconstruct from all this negative, toxic. Well, it's like some of it is negative and toxic. We have made this culture of just like, I've heard this typical sermon, which is basically, you're not a good person, you're sinful, you deserve to go to hell, but oh wait, Jesus died to save you, so you better give thanks to God because Jesus.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, there's truth there, but where are we leading people?
Mhm.
Because the only place that leads, and I know there's, I go on and talk about the dirty, rotten sinner complex,
Mhm.
but that I think that's a big part of the Christian story, and why it talked about the good wolf in that parable. You can't separate that story from Christianity because
Mhm.
um, that story it talks about all the virtues that Christianity made to be the virtues that people looked up to at some
Mhm.
level. So um, those are the things we need to focus on as well. Goodness, truth, and beauty is kind of what the 20th century philosophers really tried to start to point people toward as rationalism and this whole kind of objective world science took over. So there's goodness, there's truth, there's beauty, and they stand outside of the knowledge realm,
Mm.
and we as Christians are pursuing something that's greater.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think we're going to talk about the Dirty Rotten Sinner complex a little bit more because that's going to be coming up here in one of the upcoming clips. But why don't we hop on to the next one before we get up there?
Part of the problem is, as Christians, we've framed our faith in this way. Believe in Jesus so you can go to heaven when you die. Right? But the problem is, what do we do in the meantime? If we're just believing in Jesus so that we go to heaven when we die, are there actually any implications for the here and now? Does it change my life today? There's only one time that Jesus even talked like that in the scriptures. When he's on the cross, he turns to the thief next to him who's dying, and he says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Other than that, you read the words of Jesus, and he's giving instructions. He's saying, take up your cross daily, deny yourself, and follow me. He's saying, go sell everything you have, give all that to the poor, and then come follow me. He's offering up a new way of life. He's inviting people into a different way of seeing things. And as Christians, we have to challenge ourselves. It's not just believe in Jesus so you go to heaven when you die. Jesus says eternal life is this, that you know God and that you know Jesus whom he sent.
So I kind of, in thinking about this, it seems kind of like the opposite end of the scale of what we were just talking about, where like on one side you have, kind of the words that you just spoke about, how kind of like the battle's already been won. And on the other side you have, we're broken, we're dirty, we're rotten, there's nothing good about us. And it seems like there's a place to think about both, but it's finding a balance between the two. Would you agree with that? Or am I maybe not thinking about that properly? Because like we don't want to just focus on that, because there are things that we are called to do in the here and now. Like we do like need this renewal now, but at the same time, we can't be stuck in the dirty rotten sinner complex where that's all we're focusing on, and we're not putting enough emphasis on, the idea that of what God's already done for us, and like how the battle's already been won.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is kind of like there's the now component and the
Yeah. What I'm saying is, it feels to me like there's a balance, and anytime like you shift your focus to one, people are like, whoa, you can't just focus on that, and then you shift your focus to the other, and they're like, don't focus too much on that. So it's, in my head, it feels like trying to find this balance between the two. And I was just wanting to kind of get your reaction
Yeah,
that like, do you think about it differently, or maybe your thought process on it, or like how?
Yeah, I would say as Christians, it's ultimately a reliance on grace.
Mhm.
So if we're focusing on ourselves, I think it was Max Lucado who said, humility isn't or maybe it was C.S. Lewis actually, and then anyway, he said humility isn't thinking about yourself as less, it's thinking about yourself less,
Mhm.
right? So humility or a proper understanding of ourselves is actually it's going to direct us more and more to God and relying more on Him. And relying on His grace, which is His favor, His love, His posture toward us. So God's posture is that we're His favorite. Okay. Now, do we deserve to be God's favorite? That's what we have to sit with.
Mhm.
I don't deserve to be God's favorite, but that doesn't matter. Okay. I'm not earning it because I'm a great person. I'm earning it because Jesus gave it to me. That's the basis of my position before God. And our position before God, although we don't deserve it, is that we're His favored children.
Mhm.
So grace literally just means favor. So I think a helpful frame is like we're God's favorite. Each of us individually is God's favorite. So while it's true, that it's not because of anything within us. Like so we shouldn't sit before God and be like, yeah, I'm so great.
Mm.
And you hope your kids don't do that either, right? Because then it's ultimately not about your relationship. It's like, oh man, look how good I am at X, Y, or Z. It's like, oh, that's not why I love you.
Mhm.
I love you because you're mine. So I think that's the helpful frame, is to say we are God's. So God has claimed us. We are His. So how does that then move us forward here right now? Like we are God's right now, and God's made promises to us here and now and forever and eternity. So I think it's holding both together, not necessarily to balance. It's not necessarily balancing out like my sinfulness with God's grace. I mean, it's part of it, I would say, but
Mhm.
ultimately just more that, ultimate reliance on God and what He
Sure.
delivers to us.
Yeah, I think that answers it pretty well, just kind of putting it into kind of a deeper context. And that's kind of what I'm looking to get out of this podcast, is to be able to kind of talk about some of these things and maybe just like reframe the way in which we think about them. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Why don't we so a lot of the discussion and the message here was kind of about the heart. So I want to kick that over to you and kind of give you the opportunity to kind of expound on like how our heart, maybe like the nature of our heart, and then like why it is that it's specifically our heart
Yeah.
that needs renewal and not,
That's
or
good.
why we're starting with that over something else.
Right. Yeah. So Dallas Willard makes the point in his book Renovation of the Heart that the heart is kind of like the seat of the will or the intention. And as you read the scriptures, the first place you really start to encounter the heart, you see it in Genesis chapter 6 when God's like, He gets upset because all of the man's intentions of his heart are evil all the time. And then where it really comes to bear is in Exodus with the story of Moses and Pharaoh. It says Pharaoh hardened his heart. So you can see that as what the seat of intention or your will, or what is maybe directing the ship. So while your heart doesn't maybe convey or capture all of you, it's maybe the directive force within you. It's not even that your will is what's done, right? Only God's will is done. Our will isn't always done, and we can want something that never happens. Like you can want to marry a famous celebrity, right? That can be your desire. You can start orienting your life around that, but that doesn't mean it's ever going to happen.
Mhm.
So the intentions of man's heart, are one thing, but the Lord is what directs our steps. So I think it's important to start with heart, to look at like what are our internal motivations. What are those things that are driving us and pushing us forward, and God talks about His heart, the heart, and even 1 Samuel 16, it talks, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. So God is interested in how our hearts are directed, and then our hearts are properly directed when they're centered in God's will, right? And say like, well, God, what's your will? How can I direct myself that way?
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So when you taking a look at kind of the state of our country, the world, society, and kind of like the direction that everything feels like it's heading. I feel like a lot of that can be traced back to, I don't know, the motivations of the heart. So going off of that, I don't want to get too controversial here, but do you think that maybe the Lutheran Church needs more of an emphasis on renewal and revival? Like, do you think that's an area in which like we could use more of a push kind of for that, or more discussion about it?
Oh, totally.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I think we like to talk about sin and grace, but I don't think we don't do a very good job of taking in the totality of sin. Like the bigger the problem, the bigger we have to make God.
Mhm.
And I don't think we always want God to be that big,
Mhm.
but God is that big, and our problems are that big. So um, I don't think we're often honest about our intentions,
Mhm.
even as Christians. And it starts with an honesty toward ourselves. We don't even tell ourselves the truth about our intentions. Like, this is actually what I'm after. Like, we can hide that from ourselves. So there needs to be that, in Psalm 51, created me a clean heart, oh God, renew a right
Mhm.
spirit within me, and even in that Psalm 51, David says, you desire truth in the inmost being. At our deepest level, God wants truth. And that means we need to be true about where we are in the depths of our own sin and how twisted our own wills are. Yeah, Martin Luther wrote a book, Bondage of the Will. He talked about how twisted in on themselves our hearts are and how they actually can't be set free by themselves.
Mhm.
So as Lutheran Christians, we should be leading the charge to say, yeah, our wills are twisted. We don't have free will. We're bound by sin.
Mhm.
And we as Christians are still in that boat unless the Spirit is working in us,
Mhm.
to direct us in a new way.
Yeah. I think I don't know, it's interesting how um, I feel like God's kind of like instructions for how we're supposed to live or um, whatever you want to call it, rules, laws, basically like the model for which that we're supposed to follow is it's actually a lot clearer than sometimes we make it out to be, or than sometimes maybe I personally make it out to be.
Yeah.
I think in the way that I think and process information, I very much so like need everything to make sense to me and be in a box. And like I was saying before, like I like think about things in terms of like on a scale and like or like the duality of things. And it can be easy for me sometimes to fall into just this thought process of like, yeah, there's some things that we know for sure, but at the same time, like there's a lot of things we don't know and there's information that we don't have and like we don't have the full picture. And while we're not supposed to, it's like it's contributing to this like making the waters really murky.
Mhm.
And it like I think that can sometimes take away from kind of like the reality of the situation where it's like, you know what, like this is actually pretty clear,
Yeah.
like what God is telling us to do and how he's calling us to live. It's pretty clear, like you can
Yeah.
talk your way around it all day, but
Exactly.
like there's a little bit of, kind of being called out there where it's like, no, actually, like, what you're supposed to be doing.
Right. And I think part of that we'll get into a little bit too about the, renewal of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we need to figure it all out and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing? But I think you're right on there.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's hop over to the next clip here. We've kind of touched on the whole dirty, rotten sinner complex, but we'll play a clip here and we can maybe get into it a little bit more.
Yeah.
There can be this mentality among Christians, yeah, I'm a poor, miserable sinner. I'm a dirty, rotten person, and there's nothing good in me, right? And the problem is, where that leads is, well, there's nothing I can do. And we just kind of throw up our hands and say, well, this is the way it's going to be. It's true that there is nothing we can do to earn our favor before God or grace. But the reality is that Jesus has done it all for us, and Jesus is actually putting his life within us. Jesus has promised to renew our hearts and our spirits and our bodies and souls. Right? We're waiting for the resurrection, where he's going to make all things new. And we recognize that process begins today as we work to renew those broken things in our lives. So that dirty, rotten sinner complex, it actually just keeps us from growing. It holds us in the same place.
So we've kind of touched on a decent amount of that already. Even looking at some of my notes here, I'm like, we kind of talked about a bunch of that. But one thing, another note that I had here, which is kind of maybe jumping around a little bit, but thinking through this whole kind of like dirty, rotten sinner complex, or trying to balance out. I keep using the word balance, it's just like the way that I think that between like the concept of how the battle's already been won. It brings me back to a discussion that I remember having in a theology class in high school. I went to a Lutheran Christian high school, and we talked a lot about, people had a lot of questions about, what happens to babies when they die? Do babies go to heaven? What happens to people who, live in remote parts of the world? What happened to, the people that lived like right after, Jesus died on the cross and ascended into heaven, but they lived in other parts of the world, like all these kind of
Yeah.
like what appear to be gray areas where like we don't really have the answer. It's also not
Yeah.
our job to have the answer, but
Right.
we naturally like we want to know, we want to understand. And it kind of makes me think about how kind of as Christians when we sit here and we, talk about these topics and we talk about these issues and how we're, called to do more and to be more and to be renewed and to like what our life is supposed to look like, how this renewal is supposed to kind of like change our life and maybe change the way that we live, the way that we treat other people, the way that we, worship God. It makes me think about and wonder like how does that are we kind of like because of the fact that we have these opportunities or this education or this knowledge, does that kind of like raise the bar for
Mm.
us? When you think about people who,
Yeah.
they I guess the best example is like a remote part of the world where all they hear is a small bit or small amount about Jesus. They're not sitting here having conversations like this. There isn't the same level of understanding of some of these topics or maybe the way in which they're supposed to live their life. So how do we hold those two things where like for those people is that enough for them for salvation, but for us is it we don't want to just focus on that because there's so much more to it. Does that kind of make sense? Do you see where
A
I'm
little
going
bit.
with
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Okay.
What you're asking is kind of like it's almost like a relativistic look at what each of us should live, like
Mhm.
how we should live out our. And I would say that your situation in life, is going to be drastically different. And Jesus
Mhm.
makes a point of saying, the least of these are the greatest in the kingdom. What does that mean? The person who has absolutely nothing might have more in the kingdom of God
Mhm.
than you and I. So that's what we have to wrestle with, and realizing our emptiness and our depravity, and like how we don't bring anything to the table. Like that's part of it. And at the end of our lives, Jesus said, like all of us are going to be like, I'm an unworthy servant. I've just done what I've been asked to do. James chapter 3, it says, not many of you should become teachers because you're going to be judged with a stricter judgment. It's like, whoa, there's more expected of leaders. God expects more of leaders because they're leading other people. They're showing them the way. Like they should have a consistent, holistic life. And also, He's given them authority to speak into the lives of other people. So, yeah, I think God expects different things from different people because He loves us equally.
Mhm.
And in addition, Acts 17, Paul's preaching the gospel to people who've never heard about Jesus. And in that sermon, he says, the times of ignorance are now past. It's just an interesting phrase. The times of ignorance are now past because now you've heard the message. So there is something that changes in terms of our relationship to God when we come to know the message of Christ,
Mhm.
in terms of what He expects from us too. So
Mm.
does that does that start to at least bring some
I think it
clarity to that?
starts to, yeah, I think even just thinking about myself, I think that I tend to fall into, a little bit too much of the, I guess complacency would be the right word in terms of focusing on um, how much basically like that the battle's already been won and that like we, have this salvation that has been gifted to
Yeah.
us, and not focusing enough about how that is supposed to change and affect the way that we live our lives every single day.
Well, and like I said at the beginning of this, I don't know if we have a vision of what a holy life looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that are living it aren't often telling. Like you look at these people who have been married like 60 years, or faithful attenders of a church, or pillars of their community, whatever. Um, how many people are investing in the lives of others and helping give that vision? So the first step in being able to seek that renewed life, recognizing that your life is off, but then you also have to know what is it going to look like, to be great, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe not great in the sense of, but I just think about my kids. My oldest, he's in baseball or whatever. He doesn't want to play football. He struggled with basketball, but we started watching the Milwaukee Bucks, and he's way more just like excited to go out, pick up the basketball, shoot the hoops, all that stuff. because he now has a vision after watching NBA players, like seeing what they're capable of. He gets the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is that like with faith? Like we read the scriptures, and that's one thing, but we don't see like what about how to live properly with technology? Like is that addressed in the scriptures? Sure, you can abstract it out. But when you see somebody who lives that genuine life, it's like we need the vision. So how do we develop a vision of the renewed life? And then the second is, how do we actually point our hearts that way? So maybe like you're talking about being complacent. Maybe part of that is you don't know how to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk a little bit about figuring that out. How do we move forward? But maybe you actually do know how to move forward. Self-sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Just do less of what you want, more of what God wants. Do you actually want to do that? And that's the question of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to live a life that's God-pleasing? Like, really, do you want to?
Are you asking me right now?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, yes.
Yeah, you do, but do you really
Mm-hmm.
want to give up your, whatever it is, whatever
Mm-hmm.
those things are that, are
Yeah.
keeping you complacent?
Yeah.
Do you want to give that up? No, probably not. So actually, we have to start to change our hearts. It's like, no, I do want to give that up. It's actually keeping me from a more meaningful life.
Mm-hmm.
So we get the vision, and then if we don't intend to act on the vision, we're never going to. That's how we are as humans, right? We're not going to do what we don't want to do.
How do we get to the point where we don't where we want to do that? I think that's probably the biggest step for people is because once you make that switch over in your mind, it's like, of course, that's going to make it easier. But it's that getting over the top of that hill when you're then on the way down. It's like that's the most difficult part.
There's a few ways to get there. The first is enough pain.
Yeah, well.
So you just experience enough of the pain, and you're like, I gotta change. I don't want this pain anymore. That's the negative. But there's also the positive. Like, I want that beautiful life. I just see the joy that exudes from those people, and I want that. So I'm going to start changing my heart so that I can get where they are.
Mm-hmm. And I think, well, like you just said, it's when you see that joy in somebody else. So, I mean, naturally, that brings in the topic or you've got to be surrounded by people who are a good example of that.
Yeah.
Like if you're only surrounding yourself by people who, don't exude that joy or fall into the same things that you do or don't hold you accountable for things. I think it's a lot harder. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder to get to that point when everybody else around, you feel the same as everybody else around you. There's no difference there.
Yeah. And how do we then push into, well, and that's why it's important to be in the scriptures, because we are surrounded by examples in the scriptures, but also just, reading about other Christians, being connected to a larger, community is, it's super important.
Sure. Well, why don't we, so we already talked about the next clip, so let's skip that one. Let's just go to the last clip here.
I want you to pause for a moment. I want you to think, where are you right now? Are you feeling like a shrub in the desert? Is your life feeling a little dry and like it's not bearing any fruit? Where are you? And what would it look like? What would it look like if God were physically present in your situation right now? What would it look like if Jesus came in and said, you can reach out your hand and touch the kingdom of God right now? I'm looking to renew your life. What would happen? What pains and trials and personal struggles would immediately vanish? What would happen? Where does that life now and forever look like as God's kingdom starts to break in to the situations in which you find yourself?
Yeah, so I wanted to play this clip just to kind of get people thinking about where they need renewal in their life, and also kind of like we've been touching on what the benefits of renewal are, and kind of like giving an image to that, and kind of maybe being able to encourage or just like point people in the right direction.
Yeah.
Of like how they can start thinking about that in their own life moving forward.
Yeah, in Revelation, Jesus says, "Hey, I'm at the door and I'm knocking." And so that image, Jesus is there knocking at the door of your heart. Okay. When he comes in, what's going to change? What do you want to? What do you hope changes? And I think that's starting to develop the vision for ourselves. Like, gosh, I just want to be better with my time. My heart is so twisted in on itself. I'm so focused about what I can get from other people, and the presence of Christ in this situation would drastically change that aspect of me. So start thinking about that. Like, what is that for you? What is it for me? I feel like for me personally, I worry about my productivity. I worry about what I'm doing. And the ironic part about worrying about what you do, it generally keeps you from doing
Mhm.
what you're called to do.
That is ironic, but
Yeah.
it happens.
I worry, am I doing enough? So when you're living in the have to, it's like, man, why am I? You could have the same exact day, and if you're worried about what you have to do rather than what God has put in front of you, it just completely shifts your focus. So,
Mhm.
it's something like, how do I change my heart from all these things that I have to do to ultimately make myself feel better, that I'm being productive enough? I mean, like, what's there in my heart actually? Just saying, God has put countless opportunities in front of me, but these are the ones that He's put on my heart. These are the things I can do today by the power of God.
Mhm.
And Lord, help me do them. Help me do them with joy.
And I think to be able to have that conversation with yourself, or to be able to kind of like find those things that are going to be maybe unique to you, that kind of like when God's knocking at the door, what are those things that you want to change? To be able to like kind of answer that question for yourself, you need to
Mhm.
be able to like be intentional about creating time and space to do that. I think it's so easy, which we've kind of talked about in some previous podcasts too, to like the world is so quick, it's so fast paced, there's so little bit of everything all the time that
Mhm.
that is immensely difficult to even be able to sit down and be like, okay, like I need to think about this. Like
Right.
because it's not an easy thing to think about or figure out
Mhm.
because it feels gross and you feel condemned and you feel kind of like the weight of the things
Yeah.
that are wrong with you that you're doing that you're not supposed to be, and it can be painful. So it's so much easier to just be busy all the time, and I just have so much stuff going on, even though I just watched 3 hours of Hulu, like stuff like that, where
Right.
you have to be really intentional to even get to that point.
Yeah, and I was trying to figure out how I could weave this in. So thanks for
Mhm.
the perfect segue. It's my 10-year wedding anniversary today, and so it's like, gosh, how do we celebrate it today? But it doesn't need to be celebrated only today. And I want to carry that joy of celebration every day, because every day is a great day. Whatever. But I also wanted to share my socks. So I don't even know if this will make the screen if I can lift my legs high enough. But check these out. My wife's face on socks. Is that on camera anywhere? There we go. Pretty sweet.
You'll
Yeah.
be wearing them every day.
Yeah, she says I can't wear holes in them though. So there's the challenge. So, but anyway, like, um, just living in the joy of the celebration of, hey, this is another day of marriage,
Mhm.
and whether it's the anniversary or whether it's the day or 2 or 3 or 18 after the anniversary, whatever, it doesn't matter. 6 months, uh, living in the joy of like, hey, this is God's blessing for me, and you're not trying to put so much on one moment. That is a big part of our journey. So
Mhm.
sitting with the enduring process of life, and I think that's also where we start to see growth. You think about like exponential growth is like, it's very slow at the beginning, right? But
Mhm.
what does it say in the Bible? We'll reap the harvest in due time.
Mhm.
So I'm just praying when I'm 40, like my life is radically different than
Mhm.
now at 32.
Yep.
And I just exude that and I also am helping younger people, younger leaders see that it is a journey. You're not going to have it all figured out right now. Let's just walk together, like find some people to walk with, and we'll get there. We'll get there. And, I don't know if that
Mhm.
makes sense, but
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm excited about this uh, sermon series coming up. I think it's going to be really helpful and beneficial to a lot of people, even selfishly to myself. I'm really excited to be
awesome.
able to
Me too, man. Me
film the
too.
rest of these services and kind of like dig deep into a topic that I feel like from the get go I'm already super interested in. I'm gonna. I think we're pretty close to wrapping up here, but I'm kind of gonna put you on the spot here.
Let's hear it.
And for anybody who's listening right now, if they just want to do something, one small thing, they're gonna open up their Bible right now and they want to get a little tidbit of something to do with renewal. What do you have a recommendation? What should they read right now? Very quick, one chapter, one verse,
3.
Colossians 3.
Colossians 3. It talks about putting off the old self with its practices. It's good. Paul clarifies, put off the old self with its practices, which he talks about in previous verses. So read Colossians 3 and you'll see all those old practices. But we have these habits and rituals and routines that are just part of the corruption of our hearts. So put off that old self, realize your old habits, your old routines, your old practices, and put on the new self, which is being renewed in the image of the knowledge of the image of God, or something along those lines. So Colossians 3 would be the place to turn. Also, coincidentally, my wedding text. So there's a lot of good stuff there.
There you
go. Turn there and start to unpack what it means to experience that renewal.
Great.
In Christ.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sitting down today. Thanks everybody who made it all the way through. Were
you worried?
I don't know.
You worried they'd make it all the way through?
Yeah. Hopefully people don't click off. I don't know. But
you're gonna make Nick feel bad if you click off too soon.
Yeah.
So.
If you made it this far, we would love for you guys to be a part of this podcast as well. Submit questions, whether you're watching the services and you have thoughts, you have reactions. If you have a clip you want us to dig more into, send us a DM on Instagram, on any social media.
Mm-hmm.
Send us an email at, what's the best email?
firstmin.church@gmail.com.
Send us an email. It doesn't even have to be about the service specifically, just any questions at all. We'd love to bring it up. There's probably a good way to connect it to whatever it is that we're talking about. We'd love for you guys to be a part of it. Send in your feedback, comments, questions, and we will see you guys next week.
Thanks for listening to Second Take, a deeper dive into sermons from firstmin.church with Pastor Ethan Luhman and cameraman Nick. Connect with us whenever and wherever you are. Just search firstmin.church on all your social platforms or head to our website, firstmin.church, for more ways to connect and serve. Thanks, and catch you next time.